Behind me now is the boyhood home of Utah's most famous outlaw, Butch Cassidy. Although his story is a complex web of allegiances and good and bad and chaotic statuses, I don't consider him necessarily an outlaw because I believe his story somewhat ties into the cattle rustlers in the Johnson County War and the era at which people in Wyoming were fighting against the cattle barons. Although when he was born here, in Circleville, Utah in 1866, he was not Butch Cassidy. He was Robert Leroy Parker, and for some reason, when he became a teenager, he went to go as basically an apprentice with this man named Mike Cassidy, who was a cattle thief. And when he was up in Rock Springs, Wyoming, he went on to an apprenticeship of his own for a butcher. So they called him Butch, and he gave himself the last name Cassidy, and that is the start of Butch Cassidy's story. And although they say that he died in 1908 in Bolivia, most historians of Butch Cassidy do not agree with this. Now, some people say that he came back up here to Circleville and that he was buried in Dogs Canyon and then moved down here around the release of the Butch Cassidy movie in the late 1960s. Before I really go into Butch Cassidy's life and story, I should point out that this local character and historian, Marilyn Grace, believes that Butch Cassidy returned to Tom's cabin in Dog Valley, where he died in 1937. His remains were buried there and later transferred over to this cemetery after the release of the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, because there was a fear present that someone might come and dig up his bones, because people are obsessed with searching for where Butch Cassidy really is. Nobody really believes that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid died in Bolivia. At least nobody wants to believe. So around that time, they looked next to Max Barker, Butch Cassidy's father, next to his grave with ground-penetrating radar. And what they found, they could very well classify as an unmarked grave. They did find something which looked a whole heck of a lot like bones. And they did say that when they searched the cabin up in Dog Valley, they found bits of a spine and a couple of other bones that I don't believe they've ever gone through getting DNA tested, but they could very well correlate to Butch Cassidy, although there is no real confirmation. And in the years since she has started pushing these theories, there's been a lot less attention given to it, although remote relatives of their family now claim that this story is true. One of the things you ought to know about Wild West historians is that every single one of them wants to rewrite history and piece together the lives of these mysterious outlaws who died decades ago, and I don't think it's ever really going to happen. And in the pursuit of this, they often do things which are a little bit overly ambitious. Now, the woman who discovered the grave of William Long and tied it to the Sundance Kid, Harry Longaba, I believe this is the Sundance Kid, but after she found this grave, she began searching for the grave of Butch Cassidy, which she also claims to have found in a place that nobody had ever searched before. Now, this over-ambition kind of destroyed her reputation, and as far as I can tell, the documentary that she was going to put out never really happened. But the idea here is that both Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid would have known this local area. We're in Duchesne right now, and the Uinta Mountains are a range which kind of divides Salt Lake City from Rock Springs, where both of them were active. And this would have been a highly remote area which was not too far from populated areas. They could have easily launched robberies and come back up here and hid out in the canyons. It was just as good as places like Robber's Roost or Hole in the Wall, Wyoming. Also, if you take a look into the life history of William Long, he doesn't seem to exist in the eyes of the local community before 1910 when he got married. Now, the shootout in Bolivia happened in 1908, and in his birth certificate, or in his obituary, he lists that he was born in the Bighorn Basin, Wyoming in 1860. I think this was a tip of the hat. He wanted his family to know who he truly was. He took a name very similar to the Sundance Kid's name. He picked a date of being born, which was very similar. I mean, the real Longabo was born around 1867 in Pennsylvania. And he also picked the area that they were all active, even though no white men lived in the Bighorn Basin in 1860. He was tipping the hat. And then he took up a life here and married somebody, and nobody really knew who he was in the family initially, but they all knew he was an outlaw. And in 1936, he shot himself. And they later dug him up in the early 2000s, and they determined that it was basically a match. The face was a 99.9% match for just, you know, anthropological match to a photo of the Sundance Kid. And in fact, the scientists and the doctors that were forensic anthropologists, they said it's almost too good to be true. It's certainly the same person. The DNA does not match, but there have been rumors that the Sundance Kid was adopted, that he was simply a ranch hand for the Longabo family, that, you know, and also the graves in Bolivia, their DNA does not match to either Butch Cassidy or the Sundance Kid. So who knows? But I genuinely believe that all of the coincidences lining up really point to the fact that William Long is Longabo and that he is the Sundance Kid. And in fact, if you look just down the canyon here, you can see the entrance to 9 Mile Canyon, which is where the Wild Bunch would have been active back in their heyday. Overlooking the main section of the Salt Lake City Cemetery is a plot devoted to prisoners who died at the Utah State Prison. And there is a little bit of a theory here that one of these men is actually the Sundance Kid, and he is one of the only men here who has his own stone. And his name's Hiram Beebe. In 1945, he walked into a bar and got into a dispute with the local town marshal, and he shot him. And during his time in jail, he was sentenced to death, but eventually he started claiming that he was the Sundance Kid. And partly because of that, and also partly because he was an old man at that point, they just commuted his sentence to life in prison. And he died in 1955. Now, the main thing against this is he was 5'2", and Longabo was 6 feet. Now, I've seen a lot of people trying to claim, oh, maybe he would have lost a couple of inches in his old age, but this seems like people just want to know where the Sundance Kid is truly buried, because I don't believe he's buried in Bolivia, but I also don't believe that he's buried here underneath the tombstone of Hiram Beebe. I was only told the story of Butch Cassidy here in Mercure earlier today in the Tinnick Mining Museum. Basically, the story goes that the Mercure Gambling Hall and Hotel was robbed in 1896 by 3, quote, border ruffians, but it was later kind of conjectured that Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch did this because they had the MO of attacking kind of mail delivery men and carriers of the miners' payroll checks. They later did it very famously at the Castlegate mine near Price, Utah. And the story of Mercure is an equally fascinating one for Utah Wild West history. A great deal of attention is paid to the Wild West in places like Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico, but not so much in Utah, who focuses more on Mormon history. But the history goes that in 1870, a Bavarian explorer discovered deposits of cinnabar here, and the cinnabar he also discovered contained gold. And at the time, getting gold out of rock was a lot more difficult because they didn't have what was called the cyanide mining process. So although this started a boomtown period, it didn't last too long.
And by 1880, it was basically a ghost town. And someone bought up all the property and, as was the style back then, sold it to a group of naive farmers from Nebraska. Really just dirt farmers. And they were kind of nobodies who fell for a con man. But one of them was very smart, and he was researching mining techniques and ore extraction techniques, and he discovered a experimental but unprecedented process called cyanide extraction. And he quickly discovered that it was possible to pull gold from the rocks that had literally already been mined. You might say that it really was a case of the streets were paved with gold. And overnight, the town again grew to a boom town. And this created conditions necessary for men like Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch to come here. It was filled with, although mostly from Utah, it had a lot of outside migrants, people from Italy who were attracted by the Wild West lifestyle, people from really every country in Europe. And most of these people are actually, around me, are probably immigrants from overseas. And they were drawn to this transient lifestyle, and it made them easy targets. And a big MO for the Wild Bunch, as for a lot of other desperados, was robbing train car carriers, robbing mail carriers. It was very easy to kind of just pick them off or surround them, ambush them, and hijack their truck. And that's exactly what happened, and nobody ever caught these guys. But because this is exactly what Butch Cassidy did quite a few times, people now conjecture that it was most likely him.
And that looks like a mountain lion. I don't think I want to run into that guy, so I'm about to split.
A lot of traditional tours that talk about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid often begin in Hole-in-the-Wall, Wyoming, or in Robber's Roost, southern Utah. But I think Browns Park in northeast Utah is just as fascinating because it shows that these men weren't outlaws in the traditional sense. It shows that they were anti-establishment figures. And the story of Browns Park is that as Wyoming was a territory, and as Colorado was developing into a modern state, oftentimes there were cattle barons, and these cattle barons would range their cattle on the open range and try to use any method within their power to push out smaller cattle operations. And this often involved them sending out private individuals with guns that they had recruited from a saloon who were well-known drunks and fighters, and just send them out to go kill the small-time ranchers. So the idea was they would force all the ranchers out, because if you were a small-time rancher, you would be killed in Wyoming. You would be killed in the Colorado Range Wars. So a lot of them flooded into Browns Park. And this created a sort of scenario where Browns Park was so remote, and it was filled with a lot of people who were anti-establishment, anti-cattle barons, anti-railroad barons, that the outlaws started pouring in, seeking refuge here. And when the cattle ranchers learned that these outlaws, like Butch Cassidy and Matt Warner, had stolen hundreds of head of cattle from the cattle kings, or had robbed a Union Pacific train, or had robbed the payroll from a mine owned by one of these robber barons, they oftentimes took them in with open arms and said, "You're welcome to stay here anytime." In fact, only 30 minutes south, we have a ranch that was in part built by outlaws and served as a spot where they would hide out. And this is all over Browns Park, and I'm really excited to tell this story because the story usually is only Hole-in-the-Wall or Robber's Roost. But Browns Park has one of the most interesting outlaw stories in the entire American West. One of the first things you'll want to check out when you visit the historic Jarvie Ranch that's associated with the Outlaws is the stone building behind me, which was made in the 1880s by a member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch by the name of Jack Judge Bennett. And it's said that doing time in the Wyoming State Penitentiary, he learned to quarry materials. And he built this building almost single-handedly. And the quarry, along with the copper quarry, is just up on the hill to the side of the ranch. And he was later lynched in town, and this is something which sort of brought a temporary end to the activities of the Wild Bunch in Browns Park. But the Jarvie Ranch is a fascinating glimpse of life in Browns Park. And I heard from a family that was here that actually grew up in the local area in Rock Springs. They are the descendants of people who had homesteads in the area. And they said, sadly, a lot of these were burned down when it became public land. They said a lot of the homesteads, they still have gas canisters next to them because the Bureau of Land Management wanted to burn them down because it was
You know, they considered it unsafe, and it's just, so much history has been lost, but history like the place behind me made by Jack Bennett, who was later lynched, it still remains. John Jarvie was a Scotsman who moved down south of Rock Springs, Wyoming to establish his ranch in the 1880s near the area of Browns Park. And because of that, one of the couples that I was talking with that was touring Browns Park told me that there were so many outlaws funneling through. You had a man named Ewing who ran a copper mine who would kill the workers once they found out his outlaw connections. You had people funneling through, escaping their way from the law, and one of the things that Jarvis did to establish himself as a well-known figure in the area is to make the river crossing across the Green River. Because at the time, this area was popular with backcountry fur trappers, with hunters, with lead prospectors or copper prospectors, and it was a wild country. So he made this to help ferry them across the river. And for a period of time after the Meeker massacre and some of the battles with the Ute Indians here, they decided to go back up to Rock Springs, but once the kind of conflict had settled down, the Jarvis family came back down and made a living kind of funneling people across the Green River, which it's surprising to see this is all original ferry materials. It's still here all these years later, and I think it's a fascinating time capsule of history that thankfully wasn't burned down with a lot of the other homesteads back in the 1970s and 80s. Behind me now is the Jarvis Ranch, and I'm standing on a hill overlooking it where the cemetery is for the ranch. But in reality, I think that these graves are being repaired. But the story goes that buried here are 4 separate people. One of them was a man by the name of Hook, who was the first mayor of Cheyenne, who died in a mining expedition rafting down the Green River. The second one was a young prospector, a young boy, who we don't really know who he is, but he was killed by a local con man named Ewing. And Ewing himself is also buried here. And Ewing's story is that he was a copper prospector, and he lived up Ewing Canyon. And people would go to invest in his prospecting claims, and they would always fall through because Ewing was a con man. And one of his accomplices actually formulated this plot against him. You see, Ewing fell in love with a sex worker up in Rock Springs, brought her down here, and the two sort of had a falling out. So Ewing's partner started falling in love with her, and they formulated a plot, and the two of them killed Ewing and ran off together. But Ewing was known for killing many people who had discovered that he was a total con man. And it's fitting that he came to his end and was buried in this remote canyon up overlooking the Jarvis farm. This drainage ditch behind me was constructed in 1902 to serve the Jarvie Ranch, and it was here that in 1909 John Jarvie was killed. It's said that 2 transients were arguing with him over the money in his safe. They had come onto his property and demanded that he open his safe, and he runs outside of his house and is shot between the shoulder blades of this ditch right here. And they later dragged his body up to the ferry just a little bit north of me and pushed him down the Green River, where he was found about 9 days later in a raft in a local little grove, and he's buried up in the Ladore Cemetery now. One of the most interesting men to ride with Butch Cassidy, and one of the few to actually live to tell the tale, was Matt Warner, born in 1864 to a Mormon bishop named Christensen. Now at age 13, Matt Warner killed the town bully, or at least that's what he thought. In reality, the bully was still alive, but Christensen took the new name Matt Warner and ran for the hills believing that he was a murderer. He quickly gained employment for a rancher at Diamond Mountain at a range war, and essentially this range war consisted of the rancher hiring out outlaws and desperados to capture cattle, rebrand them, and then sell them at a markup. Now, if you were caught doing this, you would be killed instantly by the stock detectives. And Matt Warner knew the risks, and he made off with about $600. And he tried to go straight for a little while and start his own small-time cattle operation, but he couldn't get away from it. So he joined forces with a man by the name of Cherokee Bangs, an outlaw from Arizona. And these two and a number of other outlaws robbed a bank. And on their way back, they were pursued by a posse, but once they reached Robbers Roost Canyon, Utah,
Utah, the posse left, realizing that it was a totally impenetrable natural fortress. Robbers Roost would later become used by the LZ Lays and Butch Cassidy. It was their hideout here in Utah. And Matt Warner later went on to go to Colorado, and he had criminal enterprises there. And it was in Colorado at a racehorse that he went up against Robert Leroy Parker, Butch Cassidy. And he bet Butch Cassidy, my horse is going to win. Now, when Warner's horse won, Butch Cassidy took it like a champ and the two became good friends. And they went on to rob the bank in Telluride, Colorado, and went on for years to ride together. Now, Matt Warner killed a huge number of people in his day, but ironically, it was the two that he killed in self-defense that he was actually convicted for. And while he was in jail for a few years, in 1900, his wife died. And for that, he was given a pardon by the governor, and there was also a lot of understanding that the Wild West was dying, and a lot of people wanted to see these men walk free. Now, when he got out of jail, he was truly a reformed man. Robert Parker went on to go try to run for sheriff, and he even wrote books about his riding with Butch Cassidy, the last of the outlaw riders. But he went to run for sheriff, and he wanted a little bit of honor, so he took the name Christensen. Now, if they had known that Matt Warner was running for sheriff, they would have elected him by a landslide. But because he ran under Christensen, not many people voted for him. And when he finally died, he decided to put the name Matt Warner on his gravestone. And I think that it is an interesting historic landmark here in Carbon County, Utah. Several interesting Wild West figures are buried at this cemetery in Price, and of the most interest to me is Gunplay Maxwell. And Maxwell's story is that he was in jail with Butch Cassidy, and they were both released at around the same time, within a week of each other actually. And him and Butch Cassidy kept in contact, and although he tried to join Butch Cassidy's gang, supposedly he was rejected. And so he embarked on a career of a little bit of stolen valor. He was telling the papers that he and Butch Cassidy were hiding out with LZ Lay in Robbers Roost Canyon, and that it was totally impenetrable. It had hundreds of men, all of which armed to the teeth, and landmines and machine guns mounted on the canyon walls. In reality, he was drifting from place to place, opening up small mining claims, and never really settling down. He killed a few people, and by 1909, he was living in Ogden, and he got into a shootout with the sheriff because the sheriff had uncovered a robbery that he was planning, and he also had a little bit of a grudge against this sheriff because the sheriff had described him as a bad man in the past, something which you didn't say in the Old West, although in 1909, the days of the Old West were rapidly waning. And so he went to go leave the bar, and on his way out, he raised his gun to the sheriff, and the sheriff shot him once in the elbow and once in the gut. And then he was on the ground, and he went to go reach for his gun again, and the sheriff shot him in the lung, and apparently some of his last words were, "For God's sake, don't shoot anymore, you've already killed me." And at the autopsy, they found track marks and evidence that he had been using opium. So his last few years definitely spiraled downhill. But he was one of the men who tried to latch on desperately to the reputation of the Butch Cassidy gang. And buried underneath him are a few other interesting outlaws whose stories I'll tell later.
Just down the way from another couple of Wild West outlaws is the grave of Jack or John A. Wilson, a relatively unknown Wild West figure. He's buried in the same cemetery as Matt Warner, and he joined the Southern cause in Texas, a native of Tennessee himself, and began a career after the war of a buffalo hunter, blacksmith, and general kind of wild man. But he was rescued from the bad side of the law by Doc Shores, and he quickly became sort of a lawman in Colorado, and then he went to the 9 Mile area, a canyon here in Utah, and brought a bunch of outlaws to justice. But his life sadly ended in a dispute with his own lawyer. He got into a shootout. This note on the back of his grave is pretty interesting. Apparently the sheriff that rescued him from the wrong side of the law was Doc Shores, although he was in Colorado. And he was quickly hired as this detective by a man named Preston Nutter, a stock detective, basically someone who would track down cattle rustlers. And he single-handedly stopped rustling in the 9 Mile Canyon, which is that huge area which stretches up from Duchesne, where supposedly the Sundance Kid died in 1936, all the way down here to Price. And again, he was killed on the streets of Price by the county attorney, J.W. Wharf, in a little bit of a dispute over irrigation rights.
We got lucky enough to find the grave of John T. Pope pretty quickly in the Vernal City Cemetery. And initially I wasn't going to tell his story, but seeing as how the local museum had his saddle on display and made a huge deal about him, he is a lot bigger story in the Wild West than what I initially thought. Basically, he became known as the only sheriff who would actually pursue the outlaws into the canyons and into these areas that no other sheriff would go after them. And this was Browns Park. This was where the sheriff basically had an understanding before John Pope that you don't go after the baddies once they go up into the mountains. But John Pope didn't know that because he wasn't a lawman. As most stories in the Wild West start, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. John Pope was walking down the road when an outlaw gang shot a merchant right in front of him and began running for the hills. Well, John Pope took a route around that wasn't following the major trail, and he got the draw on the bad guys. Well, the sheriff decided, the sheriff at the time, to just leave. He skipped town, and this happened a lot because this area, Vernal, is close to Browns Park, which is a stop on the old outlaw trail. It went basically from New Mexico all the way up to Montana and Canada. If you killed somebody, you'd basically get on this trail and then go try to escape to freedom and find a life on a quiet ranch somewhere and never be heard from again. So John Pope began pursuing all of these outlaws, and it's important to know that he went after Matt Warner and Butch Cassidy and Elzie Lay, but he wasn't necessarily arch nemesis with them. In fact, when the outlaws put out a $2,500 hit on Pope's head, he put out a $25,000 hit on Matt Warner's head. And when three bushwhackers went after Matt Warner and his friends, Matt Warner got the quick draw on him, but Pope found Matt Warner and arrested him. And at this point in time, everybody in the community, because they're used to outlaws terrorizing them, they decide to go and lynch Matt Warner. And Pope realizes that a lynch mob's forming, and he actually meets with Butch Cassidy and Elzie Lay, and they say, "We're basically the king of the outlaws in this country, but if you agree to transport Matt Warner safely to Ogden, Utah, and you treat him well and fairly, we won't do anything to pursue you. Anybody else, that'll be on them. But our gang is not going to pursue you, the Wild Bunch." And so, thinking quickly, Pope pops a paper bag, and the mob outside thinks that Matt Warner inside just got a gun and is shooting at them. So they disperse, and out the back door rides Pope and Matt Warner to safety. And Pope would go on for years to pursue and kill many outlaws and get into many different gun battles, and he always emerged victorious. And after 5 years, he had already distinguished himself as a sheriff before settling down and only dying in the middle of World War II in 1943. In the late 1870s, the Bassett family immigrated to Utah from Arkansas, and by 1893, a young Josie Bassett married at age 19. And being in the remote area of Browns Park on the Outlaw Trail, she quickly made friends and good acquaintances with these outlaws, with Ism Dart, with Butch Cassidy and Matt Warner, and the Sundance Kid. And just from talking to them, she gained the attention of the Stock Growers Association, because there was a cattle war, a range war going on. And so the Cattle Growers Association begins assassinating a lot of her friends, a lot of the people around her, including Ism Dart. And I really should do a video on Ism Dart one day, because he was a black cowboy who went from rustling cattle along the Mexico-Texas border to being a legitimate rancher up here in Browns Park. But just existing, really, a lot of these black ranchers and sheep herders were often targeted during these range wars, this one being by Tom Horn, who was later executed for killing a child, thinking it was his father. He was a hired assassin by the cattle barons. And Josie Bassett lived until she was 90 years old, out of this very cabin. She continued up until 1964, and she was apparently arrested for distributing alcohol during Prohibition. But for some reason, the park here doesn't like advertising her outlaw ties. I mean, there's a booklet about it, but the sign there just says, oh, she was a pioneer, a true blue pioneer, and they don't really talk about the kind of affairs that she had with all of these outlaws and the whole chapter of the outlaw history in Butch Cassidy, that she was basically one of the last people that knew them. I first visited the town of Schofield last year, and it was to see some of the remains of the Schofield mining disaster, but when I got to talking with a local woman, she told me that she had spent her entire life growing up in Carbon County. She took a lot of pride in her genealogy, and she had discovered through her own research that one of her distant relatives actually rode with Butch Cassidy under an assumed name. He would sort of live this family man life, and then go off rustling cattle and robbing trains. And the story here is that Butch Cassidy was friends with the local sheriff and police in the town of Schofield. So when the law really got on his tail, he would go under an assumed name and ask the sheriff or the police here for a favor, and they would send him to the jail behind me, at least for a week or so until the law really blew over, and then he would go on his merry way. And there is no sign here explaining this, or no plaque commemorating it, but I think it's a fascinating bit of local history that you would only get from talking to locals, and I'm glad I did.
So this is the new jail. I haven't found any information to really confirm this, but I believe they rebuilt it using the original iron bars, but this would have been the original bit of jail that would have held Butch Cassidy. But walking, pretty deep snow right now. Walking inside, you can see where he would have hid out while the wall blew over. And it's kind of really fascinating to think that Butch Cassidy slept on this bed.
And don't make the mistake of visiting the Mining and Industry Museum here in Helper without going into the basement and seeing these steps. It doesn't look like much, but these were the very steps that Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch walked up when they robbed the payroll of the Castlegate mine in 1897. Now, I actually found out about this by talking to somebody down in Schofield when I was there to see some of the graveyard and memorials to the 1900 mine disaster, which killed 200 people. And she was very proud to admit that her relative was actually in the Wild Bunch. He sort of did it on his off time, and he took an assumed name to do it. But basically the story goes that in 1897, Butch Cassidy and a few other people rode up and stole $8,000 from the miner's roll and walked up these steps to do it. And it's pretty fascinating to see some of the stuff around here. And of course the museum is amazing as well. I mean, in order to get here, you have to pass by a bunch of dinosaur tracks and big hunks of coal, which really just tell the story of the earth that was beneath their feet when they did it, which I think is still pretty interesting. Butch Cassidy and his gang actually have a very storied history here in Utah, something which is marketed pretty well, but not quite as well, I would say, as marketed in Wyoming. Now, their most famous hideout was the Hole in the Wall in sort of central South Wyoming, but according to locals who I've actually talked with, Butch Cassidy would even take on an assumed identity and hide out in the jail at Schofield because the local police were friends with him. And he, of course, robbed the Castle Gate mine, and even in this local cemetery here in Price, you've got the grave of Matt Warner, who rode with Butch Cassidy, but later gave up his days of criminal activity to actually become a lawman down here in South Utah. And I believe they also call him the Mormon Kid, because like Butch Cassidy, he was born in Utah and was himself LDS.
And you were talking a little bit about the bank robbery that happened in town.
Yeah, it was kind of a word of mouth. I haven't ever seen it in writing, but there was a bank robbery back in the day. Supposedly, a couple of guys robbed the bank, got a bag of silver dollars, and went down through one of the canyons, was headed off by two posses and killed. And as far as anybody knows, the silver dollars have never been found.
And what year was that?
I'm not really sure on a year.
Either way, having a bag full of silver dollars, that's a good payday, huh?
That was a good payday back then, and now them same silver dollars are worth many, many times more than the base value.